Hello and welcome to a special episode of The Partial Historians. It is Dr. Rad here today, and I'm going to be reading you the final installment from our bonus section of our new book, Your Cheeky Guide to the Roman Empire. We thought we would release this bonus episode to coincide with the release of our book, which is out in the world today. How exciting! So we had this bonus section called With a Rebel Yell. So far we've looked at Spartacus and we've looked at Queen Zenobia. And today I'm going to be telling you all about Masada. Last man standing, Masada. The Romans are well known for their relentless conquest of various territories. However, it is one thing to capture, another to keep. In 66 CE, the Emperor Nero's reign was imploding, and whilst the Romans did not know it, civil war was not far away. The last thing they needed was a serious revolt, but that is exactly what they got. Welcome to Judea, part of Rome's holdings in the east. Judea had been administered by Rome from 63 CE. Thanks to some timely assistance from the local elite of Judea to Julius Caesar during the Alexandrian War, better known as his meet-cute with Cleopatra, the Jews of the empire had been given special privileges, including religious freedoms. After the death of Caesar and an ever so slightly concerning invasion by the Parthians in 40 BCE, the Romans decided to appoint the ruler of Galilee, Herod, as monarch of Judea, so he was a client king of Rome. Yes, that Herod, the one from the Bible with the grudge against male babies. Herod had Rome's support, but he still had to fight a rival before ensconcing himself on the throne. The blood spilled on his quest for power did not endear him to all of his subjects. Herod's ongoing ties to Rome, the man, also did not help, although there were ups and downs in that relationship as well. What better way to make yourself feel secure than with a home makeover? Herod embarked on a few building projects in his time, but our focus is his overhaul of the existing fortress of Masada. It was constructed on a plateau in the desert, located to the west of the Dead Sea, the lowest point on Earth, and completely surrounded by cliffs. On the eastern side, it was around 350 metres above ground level, and it is 400 metres above the Dead Sea. Perfect for yoga retreats, James Bond films, and military purposes. Herod's renovation project here resulted in palaces, bathhouses, storage areas, cisterns, everything you could need in a desert fortress palace. Words cannot really capture how breathtaking this site is, so please look it up right now. We'll wait. However, Masada did not become infamous during Herod's reign. The king died in 4 BCE, and his territory was divided between 3 of his sons. Archelaus received Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, but was not as successful in lording it over others as his dad, and the Romans had to step in and send him to the naughty corner for ticking off too many of the local elite. The result of this was that Judea became more enmeshed in the fabric of the empire, finally being incorporated into the Roman Empire as a province in 6 CE and administered by a Roman governor, or prefect, who answered to the legate in Syria. Over the next 60 years, some notable problems arose in Judea. First, there was that whole Jesus thing that the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilatus, ended up having to deal with. The atmosphere also became pretty toxic during the short reign of Emperor Gaius, or Caligula. Competition between factions thrived due to his policies about client kings, and the erections of altars to the emperor did not please everyone in Judea. Excuse me, Mr. Emperor. Yeah, I have a note that says I don't have to worship the Emperor. Like, it's literally against my religion. I'll, totally sacrifice in the temple for Rome and for your well-being instead, twice a day. The tension over this issue between Gentiles and Jews quickly escalated into violence against the latter. As Gaius spiraled more out of control, it was perhaps fortunate that he was assassinated before the situation became an armed conflict. Claudius, his successor, proved to be more adept, but that did not mean that there weren't still incidents, like the time a Roman soldier flashed a crowd of Jews during Passover. It didn't end well. In spite of these hiccups, most civilians lived peacefully, if not happily, under Roman rule. Insert the Monty Python, "What have the Romans ever done for us?" scene here. If you haven't seen that, you must put this book down immediately and Google Life of Brian 1979. There is a gaping hole in your education that must be corrected immediately. Most of the tension in early 1st century CE Judea was caused by local disputes and factionalism. The Romans had more of an "I want as much as possible with as little effort as possible" kind of attitude at this point. The catch was that people who were unhappy in Judea were really unhappy. Think about how you feel when you get a terrible haircut, then multiply that by 1,000,000. Back in 6 CE, the Romans had tried to conduct a census, and there had been strenuous objections from men like Yehuda from Gamla or Galilee and Zadok Haprushi. The beginning of the resistance that would lead to the events at Masada is often dated from this moment, and then you add on people becoming fed up with the taxation and the power Rome exerted over the position of high priest, and so on and so on. Groups formed around the ideas of Yehuda, known as the Fourth Philosophy, such as the Zealots and the shadowy Sicarii. This meant that they were mostly concerned with Roman rule, as they were fierce believers in God having absolute power in Judea, and freedom from imperial overlords was tied to that. That's my Darth Vader breathing. Their religion and political aims could not be separated from each other, and the leaders of the Zealots commonly had messianic ambitions. Again, please see Life of Brian, 1979, for the amount of messiahs that sprang up in the early 1st century CE. The Sicarii start to be mentioned during the increasingly problematic period in the 50s BCE. Their name came from the sica, or curved dagger, that they secreted under their clothing and used to assassinate their enemies, which could include the Romans, but was more likely to be someone local. Yep, even their fellow Jews. To be honest, they are a super confusing group to talk about. Some historians don't even think we should call them a group. Maybe they were just lone wolf assassins with a penchant for daggers. If they were a genuine faction, they were closely connected to the Zealots. Depending on your perspective, that made them either terrorists or freedom fighters. Local problems, religious tensions, random assassins, imperial overlords. You can see the potential for things to go seriously wrong in this part of the world. Perhaps the right kind of governors or wise emperors could have steered clear of disaster, but we're moving into the age of the Emperor Nero. Neither he nor the men he placed in charge managed to calm the farm. Those revolting Romans. The first Jewish revolt started in Caesarea Maritima, where the relations between Jews and Gentiles had seriously deteriorated. A dispute over land next to a synagogue got ugly, and after a scuffle, the Romans arrested the Jews involved. Word of this reached the Jews in Jerusalem. The prefect Florus decided this was the moment to take money from the temple. When the Jews mockingly passed around a collection basket for their poor governor, he let some soldiers loose in the city. Jewish people were killed and property was damaged. Things were getting out of hand. Again. The rebellion would soon spread throughout the region. Even the intercession of the great-grandchildren of Herod the Great could not stop things from unraveling. This is where the Sicarii enter our story. Their leader, Menachem, son of Yehuda from 6 CE, rebuked the Jews for allowing the Romans to rule over them instead of only recognizing God as their master. Some of the Sicarii captured Masada and raided it for any useful weaponry. Armed to the teeth, they headed back to Jerusalem and managed to secure the upper part of the city. They unleashed chaos, killing Roman soldiers, the high priest, and destroying the main archives. No, not the paperwork. The revolt was officially underway. Except not everyone was in the mood. Menachem and several other Sicarii were murdered by members of a rival group. The remnants of the Sicarii, now led by a relative of Menachem, Eleazar ben Yair, retreated to Masada and set up camp there for the rest of the revolt and then some. So you could say they did start the fire, Billy Joel, but then they exited, stage left, only to return in the final act at Masada. Our only written account for the events at Masada, and a major source for Jewish affairs generally at this point, is from a Jewish writer from Jerusalem, Flavius Josephus. We know what you're thinking. Hold the phone. That's a weird name for a Jewish boy from an elite priestly family, and you are quite correct. Within his name lies some important history. Josephus was originally born Yosef ben Matityahu. He learned about the different Jewish sects, the Essenes, Sadducees, and Pharisees, whilst a teenager. He became a Pharisee and was caught up in the first Jewish revolt when it broke out. The Jews set up a provisional government, and Josephus was put in command of Galilee, which was the district targeted first by the Romans. It was an unequal fight, and Galilee was soon captured. The final fortress, Jotapata, to be taken, only surrendered after a siege that lasted for 47 days. Josephus was one of only 40 survivors from Jotapata, who tried to hide from the Romans in a cistern. The Romans figured out where they were, so the survivors allegedly decided on a suicide pact. Josephus claims that he was not keen on the idea, but who was he to say no? He talked the others into drawing lots to determine how this pact would play out. And wouldn't you know it, Josephus drew the last lot, which meant that he and one other man were able to change their minds about the whole suicide thing and just surrender. As a prisoner of war, Josephus was brought before the commander, who happened to be Titus Flavius Vespasianus, or Vespasian. In around 2 years, Vespasian would be emperor of Rome, but of course no one knew that yet. To anyone paying attention, it was common knowledge that Nero's reign was in serious trouble, and Josephus, showing his political savvy, told the commander that he was destined to be emperor. Flattery gets you anywhere. Vespasian kept Josephus as his prisoner rather than sending him to Rome for a trial. Not long after this encounter, Vespasian had to press pause on his part in the Jewish revolt, whilst he went off and secured a slice of world domination in the civil war that raged after Nero's death. When Vespasian finally triumphed, he freed Josephus. Boy, did that prediction pay dividends. With Vespasian off being emperor, his son Titus took over the squelching of the Jewish revolt. Unpause. In 70 CE, Jerusalem was placed under siege, which was truly horrific. People were just as likely to die from famine as anything battle-related. Josephus was present with Titus, playing a key role by walking around the city walls and telling the citizens to capitulate. Did we mention that Josephus was not super popular in Jewish circles after 67 CE? After Jerusalem had been taken, Josephus returned to Rome. He was granted Roman citizenship, membership in the club, and was made a client of the Flavian family. Not a bad place to be. Josephus incorporated the clan name of his patrons into his new name, becoming Titus Flavius Josephus. His patrons requested that he compose histories about the first Jewish revolt and the Jews, and thank God they did, or we would have much less to go on. Obviously, it's a huge advantage to have a source written by someone who was part of the revolt, but Josephus was not at Masada. He may have had access to the commentarii or reports composed by the Roman officers who were present, but we can't be sure. We certainly don't have any such accounts ourselves. Let's see what he said about the last stand. Besieged. The The Sicarii had not just been twiddling their thumbs since their move to Masada. They had been conducting raids, the most well-known one being on the nearby village of Ein Gedi. Josephus records that this raid involved the slaughter of 700 women and children, and the men were forced to abandon the city. However, they would not be left to do as they pleased for long. Once Jerusalem had been decimated, just a figure of speech this time, the Romans decided to do what they do best: crush the enemy completely. Lucilius Bassus, the governor of Judea, trotted off with his army in tow and took the various fortresses that had been occupied back one by one. Although the rebels put up valiant resistance, the Romans always won. In either 72 or 73 CE, only Masada was left. Bassus did not survive to oversee this last campaign and was replaced by Flavius Silva, who also thought that taking down the fortress was a grand idea. Around 8,000 Roman troops were involved in the siege of Masada, the 10th Legion, Legio Exfratensis, and some auxiliaries. At this point of Rome's history, their troops were pretty formidable. Soldiers were well trained and usually would stay in the army for their whole career. The Romans sent the Jewish rebels a clear message by constructing a stone wall around Masada. This was about 4,500 metres long, with guards posted at regular intervals, 3 metres high and 10 to 12 feet wide. 8 camps were built around the base of the mountain, right at the places someone might try to escape. Incidentally, you can still hike along the trail that connected all the camps, should you be into punishing outdoor activities. No one was getting through, and no one was getting in. They were on their own. This was not an operation that the Romans would have undertaken lightly. The desert location and isolation made it difficult to secure enough food and water for the men and animals living in the camps. The remains of some of the storage jars used to transport their foodstuffs have been found by archaeologists. Who needs plastic for packaging that will last thousands of years? As for the rebels inside Masada, they did not have to worry as much, as there was enough food and water on hand. This posed a problem for the Romans, as they could not just sit around and wait for hunger or thirst to do its thing. They had to figure out how best to apply additional pressure. The 2 existing pathways to the palace were not ideal for an assault. The soldiers would have to march up in single file, all whilst trying to carry any equipment needed, like a gigantic battering ram. We're no military experts, but that seems risky, and not in a fun way. Light bulb moment. Silva ordered his men to build a ramp that would allow for a less suicidal attack. This sounds like a lengthy construction project, but they may have built it on top of a natural spur, far less effort. The Romans were able to get up to the walls of the fortress with their battering rams. Josephus says that the Romans managed to break through the defensive wall, only to discover that the Jews had built a second wall made from wooden beams and earth, which could not be penetrated using the battering ram. Never fear, the master of destruction was on hand. Silva ordered for the second wall to be set on fire. The Jewish people may have been hopeful, as initially the wind was against the Romans and their battering ram was at risk of incineration. Soon the wind changed direction and the wall was set alight. Victory was in reach at last. It is unclear how long the siege at Masada lasted, but it probably took between 3 to 6 months to get to this point. The rebels must have known that their options were now extremely limited. Fighting the Romans was only going to end in defeat. Differing skill levels aside, they were vastly outnumbered. Supposedly, there were 967 people in the fortress, but not all were soldiers. The Sicarii, and whichever other rebels had joined them over the years, had their families with them. Whether they lost in battle or surrendered, their female relatives and children would be sold into slavery. The men would probably be killed, and the Romans sometimes got creative with executions. Eleazar ben Yair, one of the leaders of the Sicarii, talked the group into a kind of scorched earth murder-suicide pact. No one would be taken alive, and nothing of value would be left for the Romans to find. It took 2 impassioned speeches to convince everyone that this was the best plan. Although, when we say everyone, Josephus is a little fuzzy on exactly who got to make this call. It seems like the men decided on this extreme plan. On the same evening that the walls had been compromised, the massacre took place. With the heaviest grief in their hearts, men killed their families, and then the men themselves were slain, until only one remained. Setting fire to the palace, the last man left standing committed suicide. This must have been a horrific scene for the Roman soldiers when they entered the fortress. The silence they encountered instead of the battle they expected was eerie. Josephus reports that the Romans were impressed by the bravery and resolve involved in such an act. Given the fierce resistance that the Romans encountered at other fortresses, it is intriguing that we don't get a heroic battle at Masada, especially considering that this is the end of the road for the Great Jewish Revolt. The archaeology supports the idea that there was not a huge battle at Masada. Were they just not the best warriors? Or were they indeed just too few? In spite of the no survivors plan, Josephus claims that there were 7 survivors who had managed to hide whilst the killing took place, 2 women and 5 children. It was them who bore witness to what had happened that final night. The tragedy of Masada is breathtaking. However, as is so often the case, there is more to it than meets the eye. Many questions have been raised about the veracity of the account provided by Josephus. Some have even speculated that he made the whole thing up. In the absence of any other accounts, this is probably going too far, but it is worth highlighting some of the bigger questions. Josephus and the Jewish Wars. Josephus had finished the Jewish Wars, his work, sometime in the late 70s CE, so not long after the events at Masada. There is no doubt that his complicated backstory influenced his account of the entire conflict. There's a certain pro-Roman perspective to it. He had to be mindful of his patrons, and so they are presented relatively sympathetically. Josephus may have been trying to warn people about the dangers of rebelling against Rome, and the way things unfolded at Masada underlined that futility. However, on a more personal note, Josephus wanted his Roman audience to respect the Jewish people and their ancient faith. It is interesting that Josephus places the blame for the revolt on these small, quite extreme, even criminal groups within the Jewish population for starting the revolt, possibly trying to divert blame, especially from elite Jews like himself. This does not stand up, as this is just not how long rebellions work. He must have wanted to defend his own behaviour during the revolts as well. #no haters for traitors. As if his own context were not enough, we have to consider that Josephus' account was preserved by Christians. Partly this is because he was alive at a pretty crucial time and in a very important place for the Christian faith, so his perspective was useful. However, it is possible that parts of his works have been tweaked. Unfortunately, later Christians saw the events that Josephus documented, like the destruction of the Second Temple, as God's punishment for their part in the death of Jesus Christ. How did Josephus learn about the events at Masada? Was it from survivors? Did he hear it from them? Or was it repeated to him via the Romans? How did the survivors know what happened if they were hiding? Annoyingly, most ancient writers did not cite their sources of information, and Josephus was no exception. It was also not frowned upon to compose big set-piece speeches, like the ones supposedly given by Ben Yair. Would Jewish people really have violated the 10 Commandments and committed murder, even in a desperate situation? Would a Jewish person have committed suicide? Suicide was considered an honourable death in Greco-Roman circles. The Jews did not feel the same way. It was not forbidden, but it was also not desirable, so this is a tricky one, especially given Josephus' own involvement in a suicide pact. Does archaeology support Josephus' account? Again, there is no easy answer to this question, and we should remember that the Romans occupied Masada after it had fallen, so we're not dealing with a pristine site. Some finds appear to back up what he relayed, but not definitively. For example, ostraka, or broken pottery, have been found, one of which bears the name Ben Yair. Were these pieces used to draw lots on that final night? Approximately 10% of the buildings on Masada show that they were set on fire, but they were not all next to each other. This unusual find may indicate that the wooden ceiling beams had been removed to form that second line of defence, just like Josephus said. On the other hand, where are the bodies? Nowhere near 960 bodies have been found, but perhaps they were disposed of or destroyed. It does not help that some of the archaeologists who have worked on the site in recent times had their own political agenda, which coloured their interpretation of the evidence. We see what we want to see sometimes. Clearly, Josephus is an immensely complex source, and it is important to understand his limitations. Yet, he is the best that we have, so we're not going to entirely discount what he has relayed. Archaeological studies of the site are helpful but can only take us so far. It's puzzles like these that make ancient history endlessly fascinating. The fall of Masada closed the book on the Great Jewish Revolt, also known as the First Jewish Revolt, but the impact for the Jewish people and Judea was significant. As well as those who perished in the conflict, many Jews were dispersed throughout the empire in what is known as the diaspora. Jerusalem had been sacked, the Second Temple had been destroyed. This was a new era in Jewish history and religious practices. The Romans now kept a strong military presence in the area and set up coloniae. Judea itself had less of a specifically Jewish identity. Christians also left Judea and spread over the empire, taking their new religion with them, which might, wink, be important later on. As for the Romans, Vespasian and Titus were able to use the spoils they gained from their campaign to pay for some of their building programs in Rome. Hey, Colosseum! If you ever visit the Arch of Titus, look carefully at the scenes depicted on the inside. You will see reliefs that show the sacking of Jerusalem. This whole monument was designed to commemorate the Flavian-led victory in Judea. Ah, imperialism. The story of the First Jewish Revolt clearly deserves to be more widely known. And like Spartacus's revolt, Masada can no longer be considered just one of the rebellions against Rome. It has been given a much larger meaning in modern times due to its connections with the Zionist movement and national identity after the founding of the State of Israel. So that is our final installment from our bonus section with a Rebel Yell, all about Masada. We really hope you enjoyed hearing all these stories about the rebels against Rome. If you would like to read more about the last stand at Masada, then please check out Josephus' account, The Jewish Wars. We also recommend Nachman ben Yehuda's The Masada Myth, Collective Memory and the Myth-Making in Israel, as well as Jody Magnus's Masada, From Jewish Revolt to Modern Myth. Thank you so much for listening. We hope that you pick up a copy of our book and enjoy that as well. And until next time, we are yours in ancient Rome.